So what is the aggregate supply curve that we've been looking at in the last couple of videos? We've talked about why it's upward sloping, but why does it have a curve? How come our aggregate demand curve that we've been looking at is essentially straight, but aggregate supply has this curved shape? Well, let's look at where that comes from. So let's talk about the difference between the classical view and the Keynesian view of aggregate supply. The predominant theory in economics from 1776 through the 18th and 19th century, all the way up until the Great Depression, was the classical theory. And the classical theory says that the economy will fix itself, right? You've seen the videos where we talked about how classical economists see the economy as a punching bag. The economy will bounce back on its own. Well, if the economy will bounce back on its own, then we don't really need to worry so much about business cycles. Instead, let's focus on the long term. And if you focus on the long term, then what you're looking at is potential GDP. So according to the classical view, when you graph aggregate supply just is potential GDP. Okay, we're just focusing on the long run because the economy is going to return back to its natural rate of unemployment. So if the aggregate supply curve is a vertical line, as we look at the price level and real GDP, we can start to see why the classical economists says that the government should be hands-off. We really don't need the government to intervene anytime the economy starts to see a recession. Why? Because if aggregate supply is a vertical line, then if the government stimulates the economy and aggregate demand increases, it doesn't actually change real GDP. The only impact it has is inflation. It causes prices to go up. And the classical theory, right, said that prices and wages are flexible. When prices go up, then we're going to buy less goods. When wages go up, we'll hire less workers. And this change in the price or wages, well, if we're not going to buy as many goods, demand decreases. If our wages have gone up, then businesses won't hire as many workers. The economy just bounces back to its natural state. So anytime the government increases its spending, it just creates inflation, and then we buy less and prices fall back down. So the classical economists said, we don't need government intervention increasing aggregate demand because all it's going to do is create inflation. The only way to get sustainable growth is to change that potential GDP. If we can shift that potential GDP, so more quantity and quality of workers, more capital goods, more technology, more natural resources, that's how we get sustainable growth. Okay? So the classical view is really a long-term view, and so aggregate supply is the potential GDP. And to get growth, we need to increase potential GDP. And what are the 4 ways to change potential GDP? Natural resources, capital goods, technology, and the quantity and quality of labor. All right, well, what about the Keynesian view? Well, John Maynard Keynes, during the Great Depression and before that, he saw that prices and wages were sticky, right? They weren't flexible. Let's try that again. Prices and wages were sticky. See, under the classical view, let me just go back to the page before, so we have, under the classical view, you'll recall that when there was a decrease in demand, prices went down, okay? And when prices go down, interest rates go down, right? Fisher effect. And when interest rates go down, that meant it was more expensive to borrow, to buy the house, to buy the car, and that made, let me take that back, sorry. Demand went down, made prices go down. Interest rates went down because of the Fisher effect, And when interest rates were lower, it was cheaper to get a house or a car, and that made demand go up. So the economy bounced back on its own. When demand decreased, we also see people being laid off, change in unemployment, unemployment rate goes up. When the unemployment rate goes up, wages go down. We can now afford to hire more people, and that makes the unemployment rate go down. So the economy bounces back. So it was all really based on prices and wages being flexible. Now, when John Maynard Keynes was looking at the economy, he said prices and wages were sticky. So they weren't changing. And this is because he lived at a time where you had monopolies. You had big companies, very powerful people ran those companies. And so we have people like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, who own monopolies, big companies. Well, if you own a monopoly, that means you don't have any competition. If you don't have a competition, then you're not going to want to change your price. So prices were sticky. Now, these monopoly owners had a lot of money. If we look at John D. Rockefeller, for example, John D. Rockefeller was worth about $200 million in the middle of the Great Depression. And that was at a time when the average Albertan made about $212 in a whole year. And he was worth $200 million. So very rich, very powerful. And since they were very rich, very powerful, they didn't want to change prices on their goods. Now, and to compete with those very wealthy, powerful business owners, we start to see the creation of labor unions. So at that time, we're looking at about 35% of workers belonging to labor unions. And why have a labor union? You create a labor union in order to negotiate collectively. So it's not just one person negotiating their wage. We do it as a group, so we have more power. Well, if you are in a labor union, are you going to agree to a wage drop? No, and you're going to stick together to fight for wage increases. So wages were also sticky. Well, if wages and prices are sticky, then when we look at aggregate supply, according to Keynes, aggregate supply looks more like a horizontal line. Because here on the vertical axis is our prices, and remember, prices and wages are sticky. So then if you have aggregate demand, that determines equilibrium. And when aggregate demand increases, it's going to change real GDP. So if you get the government to prime the pump, stimulate the economy, you can grow the economy without changing inflation. So that's why Keynes was a component for the government priming the pump, because he believed aggregate demand could increase without it driving up prices. So what about today? Well, we have the classical view that says, in the long term, we get economic growth and we're going to be at our potential. But the world of Keynes is also true in terms of prices and wages being a bit sticky. We still negotiate our wages. There's less labor unions today. We still have monopolies, but not as many of them. So when you look at aggregate supply today, it's a combination of the Keynesian and the classical. Now you'll notice it says neoclassical here, and that's because the classical economists like Adam Smith never drew any supply curves. It wasn't until a gentleman named Alfred Marshall that the classical school of thought started to graph aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we call those the neoclassicals. So aggregate supply, when we graph it today, is a compromise between the classical and the Keynesian. You'll recall from an earlier level, the classical didn't work with the Great Depression because prices and wages were sticky, and the Keynesian method didn't work during stagflation. So the modern view is that sometimes the classical economist is right and sometimes the Keynesian economist is. So our aggregate supply reflects that compromise between the two.